The text came through at 0600, right as I was lacing my boots for physical training. I read it twice before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing. Then I sat down on the edge of my bunk, still holding my phone, and I didn't move for a long time. My father had just uninvited me from my own sister's wedding, not with an apology, not with an explanation. Just 11 words sent like an order he expected me to follow without question. And the worst part wasn't the message itself. It was that some part of me wasn't even surprised. I'd requested leave 3 weeks earlier. I'd bought a dress I never wear, the kind that sits in the back of a closet, collecting dust between deployments and drills. I'd picked out a gift, a set of hand-blown glass vases Emily had once mentioned loving during a trip to Charleston, back when we still talked about things like glassware instead of silence. I'd mapped out the drive from base, factored in traffic, planned to leave a full day early, so I could help with whatever last-minute chaos wedding week always brings. I'd done everything a sister is supposed to do. And then, 6 days before the ceremony, my father decided the guest list was full. I read the message a third time, searching for some hidden softness in it, some sign that this was a mistake, or a joke, or a misunderstanding I could clear up with one phone call. There wasn't one. Richard Caldwell doesn't send messages by accident. He sends them the way he does everything else in his life, deliberately, with the outcome already decided before the first word is typed. I called my mother. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I didn't leave one. I texted Emily instead, just a short message, something like, "Did you know about this?" The message sat there with one gray checkmark under it for the rest of the day, unanswered. I want to be honest about something. I've spent most of my adult life training myself not to feel surprised by my family. It's easier that way. When you're the daughter your father describes as difficult, because you asked why. Instead of just doing what you were told, you learn to keep your expectations low enough that they can't be dropped from very high. I joined the Army at 22, partly out of a genuine desire to serve, and partly, if I'm being truthful with myself, because it was the first place I'd ever been in my life where competence was rewarded instead of quietly resented. My father never understood that. To him, the uniform wasn't an achievement. It was a rejection. Every promotion I earned, every assignment I completed, felt to him like another brick in a wall I was building between myself and the family he wanted me to be part of on his terms, in his shape. When I made captain, he said, "That's your job, Madison. It's not a personality." When Emily bought her first house at 28, he called it the proudest day of his life. When I couldn't make it home for Christmas because I was stationed overseas, he told relatives I'd chosen the Army over the family. Nobody ever asked what the Army had chosen for me. Structure, discipline, a version of belonging that didn't depend on being someone's favorite. So, when the text came through that morning, I did what I've trained myself to do with almost everything that hurts. I put the phone in my pocket, finished lacing my boots, and went out to formation. I didn't cry. I didn't call my father to argue. I typed one sentence back to him, hours later after PT and briefings, and a full day of pretending my chest didn't feel like it had a stone sitting in it. Understood. I won't come. He didn't respond. I hadn't expected him to. Richard Caldwell doesn't do follow-up conversations. He issues a ruling and considers the matter closed the same way a judge might dismiss a case he never intended to hear in the first place. That night, I lay in my quarters, staring at the ceiling, doing the thing I always do when I can't sleep, running through logistics instead of feelings. I recalculated my leave request. I thought about canceling the dress, the gift, the drive. I told myself it didn't matter that I had a job to do, that my worth had never once depended on whether Richard Caldwell wanted me in a photograph on his daughter's wedding day. I almost believed it. Then, a little after 11, my phone rang. Emily's name lit up the screen, and for a second I let myself hope this was her calling to fix things, to tell me. The text had been some kind of misunderstanding, that of course I was still coming, that this was all a mistake. I answered. Her voice came through first thin and shaking in a way I hadn't heard from my sister since we were kids, assenti and unsteady, like she was trying to hold it together and failing. "Dad just saw that photo." I gripped the phone tighter. "What photo, Emily?" She took a breath that shook on its way in. Someone from Dad's old unit posted something on Facebook. A group photo from that ceremony you did back in the spring. You're in it, standing next to some general. For a second, my mind went blank, then clicked into place. The awards ceremony. Fort Belvoir, late March. Cold enough that my hands had gone numb. Standing at attention for the better part of an hour. I remembered shaking hands afterward. Remembered General Samuel Whitmore saying a few words to me about the work my unit had done. Remembered someone's phone flashing nearby. I hadn't thought about it since. It wasn't a moment I'd built into anything. It was just a Tuesday that happened to have a camera in it. Okay, I said slowly. And that's a problem because Dad's been staring at it for an hour. Emily's voice cracked. He called me the second he saw it. He wanted to know how long you'd been a major. I didn't know Madison. I didn't know what to tell him. I sat with that for a moment, the strange, quiet humiliation of it settling into my chest. My own father didn't know my rank, not because I'd hidden it, because he'd never once asked. I wasn't hiding anything, Emily, I said. It's public information. It's on my uniform. It's been on my uniform for 2 years. I know that. But Dad said. She stopped herself and I could hear her deciding whether to finish the sentence. Said what? He said you were trying to embarrass him. That you posed for that photo on purpose, knowing it would get back to him. I almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about it. Just a kind of tired disbelief that had become familiar over the years. By standing in a photo at an official army ceremony. Emily, I didn't even know that photo existed until you called me. She was quiet for a second, then softer. He said you weren't supposed to be there. That sentence sat strangely in my ear. Not supposed to be where exactly the ceremony had been mine to attend. My work, my unit, my award. There was no version of that day where my presence required anyone's permission, but the Army's. And that was when something shifted in my understanding of what was actually happening. This wasn't about a photo. My father hadn't been afraid of a picture. He'd been afraid of what the picture proved. That his daughter had built a life and a reputation entirely without him. One significant enough that men like General Whitmore knew her by name and shook her hand in public. He didn't fear the image. He feared the version of me it revealed, a version he hadn't gotten to shrink down first. Emily, I said carefully, why does it matter to Dad who I stand next to in a photograph? She didn't answer right away, and in the silence I could hear her breathing uneven, like she was working up to something. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped almost like she was afraid of being overheard even though she was alone. There's something else. A pause. Dad's been saying things to David about you. My stomach tightened. What kind of things about Grandpa's estate? Another pause, longer this time. He told David you don't have any claim to it. I sat completely still. Outside my window, somewhere across base, a vehicle pulled into a lot, headlights sweeping briefly across the wall before the room went dark again. I turned my sister's words over in my mind, trying to find a version of them that made sense and couldn't. I didn't know I had a claim to anything, I said finally. That's what I thought too, Emily said. But the way Dad talks about it, it's like there's something specific he's trying to keep David from asking about. Something about the money. I thought about our grandfather. A quiet man who'd built a modest but respectable amount of wealth through decades of careful work, who used to slip both of us high $5 bills when we were kids and tell us not to tell our parents. I thought about how after he passed, my father had simply taken over the handling of whatever remained, and how none of us, not me, not Emily, maybe not even my mother, had ever asked the kinds of questions you're supposed to ask when a family estate changes hands. Emily, I said, I think we need to find out what Dad's actually protecting. She didn't argue. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister and I were looking at the same, confusing, uncomfortable puzzle from the same side. It didn't fix 6 days of being erased from her wedding. It didn't undo years of being the daughter who chose the Army over the family, but it was for the first time in a long time, a small thread of us against something, instead of me against all of them. I told her I needed to make a call in the morning. She didn't ask who to. I think somewhere underneath the fear in her voice, she already suspected I wasn't going to let this go quietly. And she was right. I wasn't angry yet, not in the way that makes people reckless. I was doing what the army had trained into me for over a decade. I was gathering intelligence before I moved. I didn't call my father. I didn't call Emily again either, not right away. What I did instead was something quieter, something that wouldn't tip anyone off before I actually understood what I was dealing with. I found a civilian estate attorney 2 counties over from where my parents lived, someone with no connection to our family, no history with the Caldwell name, no reason to soften anything for my benefit. I didn't mention my rank when I called her office. I didn't need an advocate. I needed a reader, someone who could look at documents and tell me in plain language what they actually said. She asked me to send whatever records I had. That turned out to be almost nothing. I hadn't kept copies of my grandfather's estate paperwork because I'd never once been told I needed to. So, I did what felt oddly like combat prep. I called the county recorder's office. I requested probate records, public and searchable, if you know where to look. I spent 2 nights after duty hours sitting at a folding table in my quarters with a laptop and a legal pad cross-referencing dates, account numbers, and names, feeling less like a daughter uncovering a family secret and more like an officer building a case file. What I found didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, the way most uncomfortable truths do. My grandfather's will, dated 11 years earlier, named both Emily and me as equal beneficiaries of a modest trust, funded initially with proceeds from the sale of his hard business. Equal, not favored, not divided by some formula that quietly put more weight on one granddaughter than the other. Equal in his own handwriting, in a document he'd clearly taken the time to get right. But somewhere between his death and now, a significant portion of that trust had been restructured, moved into a newly created family fund administered not by a neutral trustee, but by my father Richard Caldwell, sole signatory. I stared at that line for a long time. I told myself there could be a reasonable explanation. Families restructure, finances, trustees change. It didn't automatically mean something was wrong, so I kept reading, kept comparing dates, and eventually found the piece that made my hands go still on the keyboard. A withdrawal, made 4 years ago in an amount large enough that it wasn't a rounding error or an administrative fee. The withdrawal date lined up almost exactly with the closing date on Emily's first house. I sat with that for a while before I let myself feel anything about it. I want to be clear because it matters. I wasn't angry at Emily, not in that moment, and honestly not really at any point after. My sister didn't forge a signature. She didn't ask our father to quietly move money that belonged partly to me in order to fund her closing costs. As far as I could tell from the records, she'd simply been told it was family money, a gift from Dad. Generosity dressed up as nothing more complicated than a father helping his daughter start her life. She had no reason to question a story that flattered her and cost her nothing. What hurt wasn't the money itself. It was the calculation underneath it. Somewhere along the way, my father had decided that whatever our grandfather intended for me could simply be redirected quietly without my knowledge or consent. Consent because he'd already built a story in his head about who deserved a fresh start and who didn't. Emily needed help. I apparently did not. I had a paycheck. I had discipline. I had the army in his mind. That made me self-sufficient enough not to need what was legally mine. I called my mother that night, mostly out of habit. The same instinct that makes you check a wound even when you already know it's going to hurt. She answered on the second ring, and something in her voice told me she'd been waiting for this call for longer than I realized. "Your father said you wouldn't understand," she said, before I'd even finished explaining what I'd found. "Understand what, Mom?" "That he wanted to give Emily a fresh start. That's all. He didn't think of it as taking anything from you and me." I asked what was I supposed to get. The silence on the other end of the line answered before she did. It stretched long enough that I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its bluntness that there had never been a plan for me. Not because I was owed less. Because somewhere in my father's mind, my strength had quietly been reclassified as a kind of surplus, something that meant I could simply go without. Before I let her go, I asked one more question, mostly because some instinct told me the story wasn't finished. "Is there anything else in that fund? Anything still pending?" My mother's answer came out smaller than I expected. I don't know exactly. Your father mentioned something about finalizing things before the wedding. I went back to the documents that night and found what she was talking about almost immediately, once I knew what to look for. A new transaction prepared but not yet executed, dated for a window that fell just weeks before Emily's ceremony. The amount attached to it wasn't a rounding error either. It was larger than anything that had moved before it. The wedding happened on a Saturday in early June, and I spent it exactly where my father had decided I belonged, 300 meters away, standing in for a colleague's shift so someone with young kids could have their weekend. I didn't drink. I didn't cry into a pillow or stare at the clock, counting down the hours of the ceremony I wasn't invited to. I worked. It was in its own strange way easier than sitting home with nothing to do but imagine it. I found out what was said about me secondhand, the way I find out most things about my family now. Through Emily days later, once she'd had time to process it herself. According to her, when a cousin asked where I was, my father answered smoothly without hesitation, the kind of practiced ease that comes from having rehearsed a lie until it feels like truth. Madison couldn't get leave, he told them. You know how the army is. A few heads nodded. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? It was a reasonable explanation, delivered by a reasonable-sounding man, and none of them had any reason to know that I'd actually had my leave approved 3 weeks earlier, that I'd requested time off specifically for this day, that the only obstacle standing between me and that ceremony had been a text message from him. Emily told me later that something about the moment didn't sit right with her, even before she understood why. A distant relative had pressed a little further, asking half joking whether Madison and Dad were still not talking. My father's answer had come out sharper than the question warranted. She's always been more interested in the army than family, he said. Emily said she remembered that sentence specifically because it was the first time in the entire day that something about her father's version of events felt performed rather than true. She didn't say anything at the reception. She told me she smiled, accepted a toast, danced with David, and let the day carry her forward the way weddings do on momentum and noise, and the determined effort of everyone in the room to make sure nothing goes wrong. It was David who found the folder. He wasn't looking for anything. That's the detail that matters here. The thing that made it land differently than if he'd gone digging out of suspicion. He was searching my parents' home office for a spare phone charger during the reception, ducking out for 2 minutes while Emily was occupied with photographs, and he came across a manila folder sitting on the corner of my father's desk, half tucked beneath a stack of unopened mail. My father's handwriting was on the tab, Estate Final. David didn't open it fully. He glanced enough to see numbers that didn't look small enough, to see language about a fund transfer and a signature line still waiting to be filled. He put it back exactly where he found it, and said nothing that night. But something about it stayed with him, the way certain small wrong-shaped things do, sitting uneasily at the back of your mind until you can't ignore them anymore. 2 days after the wedding, he brought it up with my father directly. He told me later he'd kept his tone respectful, careful, framed as a simple question rather than an accusation. He asked what the transfer was, whether it involved Emily, whether there was anything he and Emily needed to understand about assets that might affect them going forward. My father's response, according to David, was immediate and cold. This is a family matter. It becomes my matter, David said, when my wife's inheritance is involved. That sentence apparently ended the conversation. My father didn't answer further questions. He simply told David the matter was being handled, and that he'd appreciate David staying out of it. David called me that same evening. I want to be honest about how strange that call felt at first. A man I barely knew, my sister's new husband, someone I'd met maybe 4 times in my life, calling to tell me he thought my father was mishandling money that might partly belong to me. But there was something steady in the way he spoke. No theatrics. No agenda I could detect beyond a fairly simple discomfort with watching someone he respected be lied to by someone he was supposed to trust. I think your father's about to transfer something that doesn't fully belong to him, he told me. I don't know all the details, but I saw enough to know it's not small. I didn't say much in response. Some old instinct in me still resisted the idea of inserting myself into Emily's marriage, into a wedding I hadn't even been allowed to attend. But I also understood, sitting there with the documents I'd already gathered, that I no longer had the luxury of staying quiet out of politeness. Whatever my father was preparing to finalize wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. 2 days later, Emily called. Her voice had none of the softness it usually carried when she talked about our father. She told me she'd found a copy of the same document David had seen left carelessly on the printer in the office. And this time she'd read it in full. She'd seen the numbers. She'd seen my grandfather's original will referenced by name. And she'd seen unmistakably my signature line still empty on a document authorizing the transfer of money that was supposed to have been mine. 3 days after the wedding, my father called a family meeting. He didn't call it that exactly. He phrased it to Emily as clearing the air before things get out of hand, which was, I would come to understand his way of trying to control a conversation before anyone else could shape it. He asked her and David to come by Sunday afternoon. He didn't invite me. Emily did that herself without telling him, and I drove down that morning without announcing it to anyone but her. I walked into my parents' living room a little after 2, and I watched my father's face do something I'd rarely seen it do in 34 years. It faltered just for a second, a flicker of surprise before he rebuilt his composure into something closer to irritation. You weren't invited, he said, and yet somehow you're still causing problems. I didn't cause anything, I said. I kept my voice level. I'd learned a long time ago that volume is often mistaken for strength, and that the quietest person in a room is frequently the one everyone else is straining to hear. You always do, he said. I didn't argue the point. I set my bag down on the coffee table, instead unzipped it, and began laying out what I'd gathered one document at a time, in the order that told the story most clearly. My grandfather's original will, the paperwork creating the family fund, the withdrawal that lined up with Emily's house closing, the unsigned transfer dated for a window that had already passed. I didn't raise my voice through any of it. I didn't need to. Let's stop talking about feelings, I said, and start talking about this. Emily picked up the first page and read it slowly, her eyes moving down the document. The way people read things they're afraid to fully understand. I watched her face change as she got further in, watched the pieces she'd already half suspected settle into something she could no longer avoid. You told me this was your money, she said, looking up at our father. You told me it was a gift. It was family money, he said. That's not what you told me, Emily said, and her voice had an edge to it. I'd never heard her use with him before. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to betrayal finding its footing. My father turned toward me instead of answering her the way he always did when a situation stopped going his way. She's always been jealous of you, he said to Emily, nodding in my direction. This is what this is about. Jealousy. I didn't respond to that. I'd expected it honestly, some version of an old worn accusation meant to shrink the conversation back down to something familiar and manageable. Sisters competing over their father's approval instead of a grown man mismanaging money that wasn't fully his. What I hadn't expected was Emily. Stop blaming her, she said. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence before it. My father actually looked at her startled, like he was seeing his younger daughter clearly for the first time in years. Emily had spent her whole life being protected, praised, positioned as the easier, more agreeable Caldwell daughter. Watching her stand there, documents in hand, defending me instead of accepting the story she'd been handed, was its own kind of reckoning, not just for him, but I think for her, too. She was realizing in real time what it had cost to be the favorite. She'd never had to ask hard questions, because someone had always been managing the answers for her. My father wasn't finished, though. He still had one card left, the one he always reached for, when logic failed him. You think wearing that uniform makes you better than us? He said, turning back to me, his voice rising for the first time. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. Not because I needed to think about it, but because I wanted him to feel the weight of the pause, the way silence can hold more authority than a raised voice ever could. No, I said. It just taught me that rank doesn't matter when you're wrong. He didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in my life, I watched my father sit in a room full of people who loved him and find himself with nothing left to say. Margaret stood in the doorway of the kitchen, arms crossed, quiet in the particular way she'd always been quiet. But I could see something shifting in her face, too, some old familiar guilt finally surfacing after years of staying underwater. David didn't say much. He didn't need to. He'd already done his part simply by asking the question that started all of this, by refusing to let family matter be a good enough reason to look away. Emily set the documents down on the table gently, like she was trying not to disturb something fragile. I need to understand all of it. She said. Everything, not just what you're telling me. My father didn't respond right away. He looked for the first time since I'd walked in, less like a man defending himself, and more like a man realizing the story he'd built for so long. No longer held together under the weight of the truth, sitting on his own coffee table. Nobody moved to leave. The documents were still spread across the coffee table, and my father was still standing near the window, with his arms crossed. But something in the room had shifted from confrontation into something closer to reckoning. Emily was the one who finally asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the night she first called me crying, asking what I'd done. "Why were you so afraid of that photo?" she asked. "It's not even about the estate." "What was it actually about, Dad?" I answered before he could, because by then I understood it better than he probably wanted to admit out loud. "The photo wasn't the problem," I said. I kept my eyes on him while I spoke. General Whitmore wasn't going to swoop in and fix anything. He's not part of this. He's just a man I saluted at a ceremony. My father didn't look at me. He was staring at the folder on the table like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if he waited long enough. "The problem," I continued, "was that you finally saw me standing somewhere you never expected me to reach, and you couldn't control the story anymore. For years, my father's version of me had been carefully maintained. Difficult, stubborn, chose the army over the family. A daughter who didn't fit neatly into the shape he'd built for what a Caldwell woman was supposed to be. That version worked fine, as long as it stayed inside our house. Repeated at dinner tables and holiday gatherings, where nobody outside the family had reason to question it. But a photograph doesn't ask permission to exist. It doesn't wait for a narrative to be arranged around it first. It simply shows what's true. And what that photo showed was a woman in uniform, a major standing beside a general, who clearly respected her in a moment that had nothing to do with rebellion or difficulty. It showed competence. It showed a life he hadn't authored and couldn't take credit for. "He's known Grandpa's name for years," I added, because I'd done enough digging to understand this part, too. "Not through me. Through some old veterans organization you were both connected to a long time ago. Records from a fund Grandpa used to support. That's the extent of the connection. It was never about me showing off. It was a coincidence you couldn't stand." My father finally looked up. For a moment, I thought he might deny it, might reach for another accusation to throw across the room. Instead, something in him seemed to give out like a structure that had been under quiet pressure for longer than anyone realized. "I needed one day," he said, "where nobody questioned me." The room went very still. "That's why you didn't want me at the wedding," I said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was never about the guest list. He didn't answer directly, but he didn't need to. Emily was watching him now, with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Somewhere between grief and clarity. The look of someone realizing that the version of their father they'd trusted their whole life had been curated as carefully as anything in that folder. "You were going to ask questions," I said, "about the fund, about Grandpa's will, about where the money actually went. You couldn't risk that happening in front of everyone you'd invited. So instead of being honest with me, you erased me from the day, and then told people I'd chosen not to come. I never wanted it to go this far," he said. And for the first time his voice had lost its edge, had become something quieter, almost tired. "I told myself I was protecting the family, protecting Emily, giving her something you didn't need. You didn't get to decide what I needed," I said. "You just decided it was easier not to ask." Margaret spoke up then from the doorway. Her voice small but steady. I should have said something years ago. I told myself staying quiet kept the peace. It didn't. It just meant one of my daughters carried all the weight of what the other one never had to think about. My father didn't respond to her either. He sat down slowly in the chair by the window, the folder still on the table in front of him, and for a long moment nobody spoke. I watched something settle over him that looked less like anger now, and more like exhaustion. The particular fatigue of a man who has spent years managing a story so carefully that he'd forgotten how to exist without one. You didn't need a perfect wedding, I said finally. You needed a room where no one knew the truth. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself again. He just sat there in the quiet while the four of us stood around him, holding a version of the truth he could no longer rearrange in his favor. Emily reached over and picked up the unsigned transfer document, the one dated for a window that had already passed, the one that would have moved even more money out of a fund that was never his to move alone. This isn't happening, she said. It wasn't a question either. Not like this. Not anymore. I didn't want revenge. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy in the weeks that followed to let this become something ugly, something built on punishment instead of correction. That's not who I am. And honestly, it's not who my father raised me to be either, even if he'd forgotten that somewhere along the way. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the truth handled the way. Truth should be handled through the proper channels with documentation and accountability, not through anger dressed up as justice. The attorney I'd hired filed a formal request for an accounting of the family fund. My father, faced with the paperwork Emily and I had already assembled, didn't fight it. I think some part of him understood that the story had already changed shape too much to be pulled back together. The pending transfer was frozen before it could execute. An independent audit was ordered on the fund's history, going back to the year it was created. It would take months to fully untangle, but the unsigned document that would have moved the largest sum yet never got a signature, that much at least was stopped in time. Emily wasn't asked to return the money that had gone toward her house. That part had already happened, already been folded into a life she and David were building together, and unwinding it wouldn't have repaired anything. But she had to sit with a harder truth than a repayment schedule. She had to accept that she'd benefited quietly and without asking questions from a system that had decided I didn't need what was legally mine. That's not a comfortable thing to carry. I watched her carry it anyway, without flinching away from it, which told me more about who my sister actually was than anything that had happened before. She called me a week after the family meeting. Her voice was steadier than I'd heard it in years. I should have asked you, she said, about everything. I never once asked what you were owed or what you'd lost or why you weren't at the table more. I just accepted what I was given and didn't look too closely at where it came from. Yes, I said. Not it's okay, not don't worry about it, because some wounds don't need to be smoothed over to be forgiven. They need to be named honestly first. My mother apologized too, in her own quieter way, over coffee one afternoon a few weeks later. She didn't try to explain away her silence. She just said she was sorry for choosing peace over honesty for so many years, and that she understood now that the peace had never really existed. It had just been quiet on the surface while someone underneath it went unheard. My father lost control of the fund. The court appointed an independent trustee to manage what remained of my grandfather's estate, splitting it finally the way it had always been intended, equally between his granddaughters. Richard Caldwell is still my father. That part doesn't change, and I never wanted it to. But he no longer gets to decide quietly, and from a distance, who deserves a seat at the table and who doesn't. I went back to base. Life resumed its rhythm, the one I'd built for myself long before any of this started. Briefings and deployments, and the particular comfort of routines that don't depend on anyone else's approval. But something had shifted between Emily and me that didn't go back to how it used to be. We talked more actual conversations, not just holiday small talk, performed for an audience. We were building something new without our father standing in the middle of it, deciding who got called the difficult one and who got called the golden child. A year later, I came home for Thanksgiving. Emily opened the door before I even knocked, like she'd been watching for my car. She hugged me the way she used to when we were kids, tight and unguarded. And for a second, neither of us said anything at all. Inside the table was set the way it always was, except for one thing: an empty chair right where my father usually sat. "Where's Dad?" I asked. "He said he wasn't coming," Emily said. I looked at that empty chair for a long moment. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected years earlier, if you'd told me this was how things would end up. I just felt the quiet, uncomplicated truth of it. Things had changed. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly, which was more than we'd ever had before. "I wish things had been different," Emily said. "So do I told her. Then after a moment, "But different starts with telling the truth." My father thought he could decide who belonged at the table. For years I believed him, then one day, I understood something I wish I'd known much sooner. Being left off a guest list doesn't mean you're unwanted. Sometimes it means the people already seated are afraid of what you'll say when you finally sit down. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below and let me know which part hit you hardest. We share stories like this every day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Thank you for sitting with Madison's story today. Let's keep this journey going. He took the microphone from my daughter's graduation coordinator, like he'd earned the right to it. 200 people watched him smile. That easy practice smile I used to love. Then he said the words that would end our marriage in front of everyone I knew. I sat frozen in my dress uniform. 18 years of my life collapsing into 11 seconds of silence, and then before I could even breathe, my daughter stood up. "Dad," she said, "there's something you should know. I want to tell you how we got here, because none of this makes sense without the beginning." I was 30 years old when I found out I couldn't have children. 2 years of trying, 2 years of appointments and needles and calendars, marked in red ink, and then a doctor with kind eyes telling me the word unlikely, in a way that meant never. I remember sitting in the parking lot of that clinic in my car, still in uniform and not crying. I'd learned a long time ago how to hold things. That's what 14 years in the army teaches you, if nothing else. How to carry weight without letting your face show it. Daniel took it hard, too, or at least that's what I believed at the time. We talked about adoption. We talked about waiting. Mostly, we just stopped talking about it at all the way people do when a wound gets too familiar to keep touching. I was deployed more than I was home in those years. That's the truth. Nobody puts on a recruiting poster. The missed birthdays. The phone calls cut short by static and time zones. The ache of loving someone from 4,000 miles away. Daniel handled the distance worse than I expected. I told myself it was loneliness. I didn't yet understand what loneliness could turn into. Then one evening, I came home from a 9-month rotation and found him standing in the living room holding a baby. I remember the smell of the house first. Something unfamiliar, formula and baby powder wrong, in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind caught up. Daniel's face was gray. He didn't even say hello. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. The baby was his. A woman named Renee. Someone from his office. Someone I'd shaken hands with once at a Christmas party and thought nothing of. She hadn't wanted the responsibility. That's the word he used, responsibility. Like the baby in his arms. Was a line item instead of a life. He said she'd signed away her rights. He said he didn't know what else to do. He said he was sorry over and over, until the words stopped meaning anything. I could have walked out that night. Looking back, I think most people would have understood if I had. My marriage had been broken in the worst possible way, by the worst possible betrayal, and I owed this stranger's daughter nothing at all. But then I looked at her. She was maybe 8 months old, dark-haired, wide-eyed, entirely unaware that she'd just become the center of a war she had no part in starting. She looked up at me with an expression that had nothing to do with Daniel or Renee, or any of the choices the adults around her had made. She just looked tired and hungry and small. I don't know how to explain what happened in me in that moment, except to say that something that had been broken in the clinic parking lot 2 years earlier suddenly found a way to matter again. I reached out. She wrapped her whole fist around one of my fingers. I named her Emily after my grandmother. I didn't have to. Daniel said I could call her whatever I wanted, since I was the one who was going to be raising her, since he had never been much good at the day-to-day work of loving someone. I remember thinking even then that this was the first honest thing he'd said to me in weeks. That was 18 years ago. Now I was sitting in a folding chair in a high school auditorium, watching that same little girl walk across a stage in a blue cap and gown. And I had never in my life felt prouder of anything. Not my commission, not my medals, not a single one of the achievements that filled the walls of my office. Nothing came close to watching Emily Foster cross that stage as valedictorian. Her voice steady, her chin lifted, thanking her teachers and her friends. And I'll never forget this part, thanking her mother for never once making me feel like I was anyone's mistake. I had to look down at my hands so no one would see me cry. And then the principal invited Daniel up to say a few words, since he'd made a donation toward the new science wing, since appearances had always mattered more to him than substance. I remember thinking foolishly that he might actually rise to the occasion. 18 years is a long time. People change. Fathers find their way back to gratitude even late. He took the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, found my eyes, and smiled that same easy smile. I just want to say he said thank you to my wife Natalie for raising my mistress's daughter all these years. The auditorium went absolutely silent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. 18 years of birthday parties, and school pickups and fevers in the middle of the night, reduced in front of hundreds of strangers to 5 words that weren't even accurate. Renee had never been his mistress, not legally. Not really, just a mistake he'd made once, and never fully owned. But accuracy wasn't the point. Humiliation was the point. He wanted everyone in that room to know that the woman who had raised his daughter wasn't really her mother at all. I felt my whole body go cold. And then before I could stand, before I could even decide what I was going to do, Emily rose from her seat in the front row, turned to face her father, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of that silent room. "Dad," she said, "there's something you should know." To understand what Emily was about to say, you have to go back to the night. Everything started 18 years before that graduation stage in a house that still smelled like the life I thought I was living. I was 30 years old, freshly home from a deployment that had stretched 2 months past its original date, still adjusting to sleeping in a bed that didn't shift under me. Daniel had picked me up from the base, looking strange, not happy to see me. Not exactly nervous, just off in a way I couldn't name yet. I remember thinking maybe he'd wrecked the car or lost his job. I wasn't prepared for what he actually said. "There's something I need to tell you," he told me, standing in our kitchen with his hands flat on the counter, like he needed it to hold him up. Then he told me about Renee, about the affair, about the baby that had been born 3 weeks earlier, a baby he hadn't mentioned once during any of our calls. A baby he'd apparently known about for the better part of a year. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think people romanticize forgiveness too easily. I did not feel noble. I felt like the floor had opened underneath me. I had just spent 2 years grieving a body that couldn't carry a child. And here was proof that the problem had never been fertility at all. It had been him choosing someone else, while I was overseas doing a job that required me to trust the people I'd left behind. I told him I wanted a divorce. I meant it completely in that moment with my whole chest. And then he brought her in from the other room. Emily was so small, not sleeping awake alert, watching me with the particular seriousness that some babies have, like they're taking attendance of the room. Daniel said Renee didn't want the responsibility of raising her alone, that she'd asked him to take custody. That if I left, he honestly didn't know what would happen to this child. He wasn't a man built for solo parenting. I understood that about him even then. I stood in that kitchen holding my rage in one hand and this stranger's daughter's future in the other. And I made a decision that would define the next 18 years of my life. I picked her up. She didn't cry. She just curled her small fist around my finger and held on the way infants do reflexively without meaning. And yet it felt like meaning anyway. I remember thinking with a clarity that surprised me, she didn't betray me. She's a child. She didn't do anything except get born into a mess she had no say in. That became the sentence I repeated to myself for the next 2 decades on every hard day that followed. I didn't divorce Daniel that year. I told myself I was staying for Emily, and that was true. But if I'm honest, there was something else too. A stubbornness in me that refused to let his mistake be the thing that broke my life apart. I decided I would build something out of the wreckage instead of walking away from it. The years that followed blurred together in the best way, the way good years do. I remember dropping Emily off at preschool in her too big backpack, watching her wave at me through the glass door, like it was the only person in the world worth waving at. I remember the deployments where I missed her recital and her first day of kindergarten. The way I'd call every single night, regardless of time zone, whispering bedtime stories over static-filled lines, while she fell asleep with the phone still pressed to her ear on the other end. I remember sitting up with her through 104 degrees Re fever when she was 6, sponging her forehead with cool water while Daniel slept undisturbed down the hall. Too tired from work, he said to be much help. I remember every parent-teacher conference, every science fair board glued together at midnight, every scraped knee and broken heart, and the year she decided she hated math until I found a tutor who made her love it again. I taught her to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings, gripping the door handle while she stalled the car for the 5th time, and laughed until she cried. I taught her how to change a tire, how to read a lease before she signed it, how to tell when someone was lying to her, a skill I'll admit I developed out of necessity. Daniel was present for some of it, birthdays, mostly photos. Always he liked being photographed as a father more than he liked the daily work of being one. As the years passed, he grew more distant, more entangled in his career, more prone to long nights I never asked too many questions about. I told myself that was simply who he was. Some people give what they have to give and no more. But Emily never once treated our relationship as anything less than real. She called me Mom from the time she could speak. Not stepmom, not Dad's wife, just Mom, plain and unqualified. And every time she said it, something in me that had been broken years earlier, by a doctor with kind eyes, and a hard word quietly mended itself a little further. I used to think motherhood required a body that could carry a child. Emily taught me otherwise. One ordinary Tuesday at a time. What I didn't fully understand back then was that Daniel had started to see all of this differently, where I saw a family we'd built together out of a terrible beginning. He had begun quietly, and without ever saying so out loud, to see my raising of Emily as something owed to him, a debt I was paying off for a mistake he'd made, rather than a life I had chosen for myself, out of love every single day since that night in the kitchen. That distinction would matter more than I could have guessed, standing in that auditorium 18 years later, watching my daughter rise to defend the truth he'd tried to rewrite. I didn't make a scene in that auditorium. That was never who I was. Not even in the moment I had every right to be. When Daniel stepped down from the stage after his little speech, red-faced now that the room's silence had turned uncomfortable, even for him, I simply stood, smoothed my uniform jacket, and said 4 words. "We'll talk at home." Calm level, the voice I used to use giving orders to soldiers, twice the size of most men in that room. Daniel actually looked relieved, like he thought this meant I'd absorb the humiliation the way I'd absorbed so much else over the years. He thought this would be like every other time, a hard conversation, a strained week, then a slow return to normal. He had no idea I'd stopped returning to normal months earlier. Looking back, the signs had been there since spring. I just hadn't let myself read them the way you don't read a letter. You're afraid will change everything. Daniel had started coming home late without explanation. His phone suddenly requiring a passcode, where before he'd left it face up on the kitchen counter for years. He'd changed the password on our joint email account and never gave me the new one. When I brought up retirement planning, or whether we should finally take that trip to Portugal we'd talked about for a decade, he'd changed the subject to something financial and technical numbers instead of dreams, as if he were quietly excusing himself from a future he no longer intended to share. I am by training and temperament an observer, 14 years of active duty teaches you to notice what people are trying not to show you. So once I let myself actually look, I saw everything. I saw that Daniel wasn't simply distracted. He was preparing for something. It took some quiet, careful work. Nothing dramatic, nothing I'm proud of, exactly. Just paying attention to mail that arrived and disappeared quickly to a financial advisor's business card, left carelessly in his coat pocket to a late-night phone call. I overheard fragments of through a bathroom door. Piece by piece, I understood. Daniel was planning to leave. Worse, he'd reconnected with Renee. Not romantically, or not only romantically, but strategically. The two of them apparently aligned on some things involving Emily, and I would later learn involving me. The blow that actually knocked the wind out of me came almost by accident when I found a folder in his desk drawer I wasn't supposed to see. Inside were photocopies, Emily's original birth certificate listing Renee as the biological mother, and Daniel as the father, with a blank space where a second parent's name might have gone. There was no adoption decree, no formal guardianship paperwork. In 18 years, in all our conversations about lawyers and finances and Emily's future, Daniel had never once mentioned that I had no legal standing as her mother at all. I understood immediately what this meant and what he intended to do with it. In a divorce, in a fight over the house, over savings, over the story, the world would be told about who had failed, whom Daniel meant to use this fact as a weapon, not because it reflected any truth about our life together, but because it would look devastating on paper, because a judge, a lawyer, an audience of onlookers wouldn't know 18 years of fevers and driving lessons and midnight phone calls from deployment. They would only know what the paperwork said. And the paperwork said I was nobody. I sat with that folder in my lap for a long time that evening, in an empty house, feeling something harden in me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with resolve. Because here is what Daniel didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn about the woman he married. I am not someone who lets a story get told about me that isn't true. For 18 years, without ever intending it as ammunition, I had kept records not out of suspicion, but out of the discipline the Army had drilled into me since I was 22 years old. Every school enrollment form I'd signed as Emily's guardian, every medical consent form, every pediatrician's visit, every field trip permission slip, every insurance document listing me as her primary caregiver. Emails between Daniel and me discussing her education, her therapy after a hard year in middle school, her college fund, all of it in my handwriting, my signature, my name attached to 18 years of showing up. I had never once imagined I would need this evidence to prove I was Emily's mother. I had simply been a woman who kept careful files because that was who the Army had made me, because chaos had never suited me, not in deployment and not in domestic life either. Now, sitting alone with that folder, Daniel never intended for me to find, I understood that discipline was about to become something else entirely. Not a weapon exactly. I never wanted to hurt him. Not really, not even then, but armor-proof, the truth organized and dated and undeniable, waiting quietly in a filing cabinet for the moment someone tried to say it hadn't happened. Daniel thought he held all the power in what was coming. He had no idea that the woman he was preparing to discard had spent 18 years without ever meaning to preparing for exactly this fight. I didn't want Emily anywhere near what was coming. That was the promise I made myself the night I found that folder. Whatever happened between Daniel and me, I would not let it become her burden to carry. She had spent 18 years as the child caught between two adults' choices. I refused to let her spend her last summer before college as a casualty of a war she hadn't started. So I sat her down at the kitchen table one evening, the same table where I'd checked her homework and celebrated report cards for over a decade, and I chose my words carefully. Whatever happens between your father and me, I told her, you don't have to choose. This isn't yours to fix. It never was. She nodded quiet in a way that should have told me she already knew more than I'd given her credit for. I've since learned that 18-year-olds are far more perceptive than we like to believe, especially about the people who raise them. It turned out Emily had heard a phone call 3 weeks earlier, when Daniel thought he'd made in private late one night, when he assumed she was asleep upstairs. She'd come down for water and paused at the bottom of the stairs when she heard her father's voice, low and unfamiliar, talking to a woman Emily didn't recognize by name, but understood immediately by context. Renee, her biological mother, a woman she'd never met, being discussed like a business partner, rather than a stranger who'd given birth to her and walked away. What stopped Emily on those stairs wasn't the fact of the call itself. It was one sentence delivered so casually it barely registered as cruelty to the man who said it. Natalie was never really her mother, Daniel had said. Emily told me this 3 days later, her voice steady, but her eyes glassy in a way I recognized from every hard moment of her childhood. The fevers, the scraped knees the year in middle school when a friend group turned cruel. This was worse than any of those. This wasn't pain inflicted by circumstance. This was pain inflicted by her own father, in a sentence he hadn't even meant for her to hear, which somehow made it more honest and more devastating. She confronted him directly. I wasn't in the room, but she told me about it afterward, almost word for word, the way people do when a conversation has burned itself permanently into memory. Daniel had tried to explain himself, tried to draw some legal distinction between raising a child and being one's mother, some technicality about biology and paperwork that he seemed to think would soften what he'd said. Emily didn't let him finish. Then, where were you? She asked him when I needed someone. He didn't have an answer. Of course he didn't. There wasn't one that wouldn't indict him. That conversation cracked something open that had been sealed for years. Emily told me haltingly about a memory she'd never shared with me before, a fight she'd half overheard. When she was maybe 7 or 8, Daniel's voice raised, saying something about how maybe it would be simpler if Emily went to live with her birth other instead, since things were complicated the way they were. She hadn't understood it then, not fully. She'd filed it away the way children do with things too large, to process a splinter she carried without knowing its name. I remembered that period differently, of course. I remembered fighting Daniel on exactly that idea, refusing to let him destabilize a child who had already lost one mother's presence in her life, before she could even form memories of it. I remembered telling him that uprooting Emily, now sending her to a woman she'd never known, would be a second abandonment dressed up as a solution. I'd won that argument. I'd never told Emily how close it had come to going the other way. Hearing it now at 18, with the context of everything else falling into place around her, Emily finally understood something I don't think she'd ever fully let herself see before. For the woman her father called a burden, an obligation, my mistress's daughter, in front of 200 strangers. That woman was the one who had fought to keep her, who had chosen her actively, repeatedly at every turn, where choosing would have been easier not to make. I watched something shift in my daughter over those few days. She'd always been steady, thoughtful, slower to anger than most teenagers I'd known, but there was a new firmness in her now, a clarity that hadn't been there before. I'm not letting him rewrite what happened, she told me, and I believed her completely, though I had no idea yet what that would come to mean. I didn't ask her to defend me. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I would never have asked an 18-year-old to fight my battles in front of a crowded auditorium. Whatever Emily decided to do at that graduation, she decided on her own, with a clear head and a heart that had finally connected all the scattered pieces of her own history into a single undeniable truth. She wasn't protecting me because I asked her to. She was protecting the truth, because she'd finally understood exactly what it was. I made an appointment with a family law attorney 3 weeks before Emily's graduation, though I hadn't yet told her why. I didn't walk into that office wanting to destroy Daniel. I want to be honest about that, because revenge stories are easy to tell and harder to live, and what I actually felt sitting in that waiting room wasn't rage. It was clarity. I simply needed to understand precisely and without illusion where I stood. The attorney's name was Diane Whitfield, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on top of graying hair, and a manner that suggested she'd heard every version of my story before, and none of them surprised her anymore. I laid out the folder I'd found, the birth certificate, The absence of any adoption or guardianship decree, 18 years of a life I'd built around a child the law didn't officially recognize as mine. Diane didn't flinch. She'd handled cases like this before. She told me more often than people would guess. She explained the concept of de facto parentage, the legal recognition some states extend to a person who has functioned as a parent in every meaningful way, even without formal adoption. She explained that the mountain of documentation I'd unknowingly assembled over 18 years, school enrollment forms, medical consents, insurance records, tax filings listing Emily as a dependent. Every email discussing her education and well-being wasn't just sentimental clutter. It was evidence, substantial, dated, corroborated evidence of exactly the kind courts take seriously. We went through the rest of it methodically. The house still in both our names since we'd bought it together, 12 years earlier. Retirement accounts I'd contributed to steadily throughout my career, including the retirement benefits I had earned through my years of military service, along with the assets and savings that were legally mine, regardless of what Daniel believed about who deserved what. Emily's college fund, which I had funded almost entirely myself, a fact Daniel had never once acknowledged aloud. Diane looked over my file for a long moment, then looked up at me with something like respect. "He clearly wasn't expecting you to be prepared," she said. I almost laughed. Preparation had never been the plan, it had simply been who I was. There was one piece of evidence Diane found particularly useful, one I hadn't even known existed until she requested Daniel's financial records as part of the discovery process weeks later. An email sent to Renee 8 months earlier that Daniel apparently hadn't been careful enough to delete from a shared cloud account tied to an old joint subscription neither of us had bothered to cancel. In it, he'd written something that told me more about how little he understood me than anything he'd said in 18 years of marriage. "Natalie will never leave." He'd written she has nowhere else to go. I read that sentence 3 times before I fully absorbed what it revealed. Not malice exactly, something worse. A complete failure to see me at all. He believed I had built my entire identity around him, that 18 years of sacrifice had left me hollowed out and dependent with no separate self capable of walking away. He had no idea that I had a career that had never depended on him, a pension that was entirely my own, a professional reputation built through my own discipline across 3 deployments. He had no idea that the person he thought had nowhere else to go had in fact quietly built an entire life that could stand without him the moment it needed to. Most of all, he had no idea that Emily, the daughter he called a burden in front of strangers, had already chosen without hesitation which parent she stood beside. I made my decision in Dion's office that afternoon. I would not try to punish Daniel beyond what the law and the truth naturally required. I wasn't interested in destroying his career or humiliating him further than his own choices already had. That kind of revenge might have felt satisfying for a week, but it wasn't who I wanted to be for the rest of my life, and it certainly wasn't the example I wanted to leave with Emily as she stepped into adulthood. Instead, I asked Diane to prepare the divorce filing and to make sure my legal standing regarding Emily, now technically an adult, but symbolically vital to me, was documented clearly and permanently in every relevant record. I wanted that the truth on paper finally, the way it had always been true in practice. That same week, without announcement or confrontation, I moved my things out of the bedroom Daniel and I had shared for over a decade and into the guest room down the hall. I didn't slam doors. I didn't leave notes. I simply stopped pretending that anything between us was still intact and let the silence of that decision speak for itself. Daniel noticed, of course. He asked me once, almost gently, if we could talk things through. I told him we could talk, once the paperwork was filed and not before. He looked at me differently after that, not with anger, but with something closer to unease, as though he was beginning to understand for the first time in 18 years. That the woman standing in front of him was no longer someone he could manage with a well-timed apology and a familiar smile. He had spent so long believing I would always absorb whatever he handed me. He was about to learn in front of everyone who mattered to us exactly how wrong he'd been. Let me take you back to that auditorium. Because everything I've told you until now has been leading to this single moment. The graduation ceremony had been perfect until then. The kind of afternoon you replay in your mind for years afterward. Sunlight coming through the high windows of the gymnasium, the smell of fresh flowers from the stage decorations. 200 families packed into folding chairs, proud and restless and ready to celebrate. Emily had just delivered her valedictorian address, and I had cried without shame the way I imagine every parent in that room had cried at some point that afternoon. Then the principal called Daniel up to say a few words, and everything changed in the space of a single sentence. "Thank you for raising my mistress's daughter." The room went silent in that specific way. Large crowds go silent, not peaceful but suspended, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I felt every eye in that auditorium shift toward me. I felt my own face go hot, then cold, then strangely calm, the way it sometimes does in the field, when a situation turns dangerous, and your training simply takes over. I hadn't planned what I would do. I want to be honest about that. I had no speech prepared, no counterattack rehearsed. I was simply sitting there absorbing the fact that 18 years of my life had just been reduced publicly to a punchline about someone else's mistake. And then Emily stood up. She didn't rush. That's what I remember most clearly. The unhurried way. She rose from her seat in the front row, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked toward the small stage where her father still stood holding the microphone, apparently unaware yet of what was about to happen to him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. When she spoke, it was in the same measured, steady tone she'd used, delivering her valedictorian address minutes earlier, the tone of someone who had rehearsed nothing and needed to. "You thanked Mom for raising your mistress's daughter," she said. And the microphone Daniel still held, picked up every word, carried it to the back row, to the balcony, to every parent and teacher and stranger in that room. "But you forgot one thing." She turned then and looked directly at me. I remember the exact expression on her face. Not anger, not performance, just a kind of fierce, unwavering love that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "She didn't raise your mistress's daughter," Emily said. "She raised her daughter." I heard the room shift beneath that sentence, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Parents leaning toward each other, phones quietly rising to record what everyone in that room now understood was happening in real time. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Emily wasn't finished. And something in her posture made it clear that no one was going to interrupt her. "You weren't there when I was sick," she said. "You weren't there when I was afraid. You weren't the one waiting outside my school when I forgot my ride. You weren't the one who taught me what it means to keep a promise." Each sentence landed like a measured blow. Not cruel, just true, which somehow made it worse for the man standing frozen at the center of the stage. I watched Daniel's face change in real time. The practiced ease draining out of it, replaced by something raw and unguarded that I hadn't seen from him in years. Emily let the silence sit for a moment before she delivered the sentence that would end up weeks later quoted back to me by strangers who'd somehow seen the footage online. "So, if you're embarrassed that Mom raised your daughter," she said, "you should be embarrassed that you didn't." Daniel said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. I watched a man who had spent 18 years believing he held all the power in our family realize, in front of everyone whose opinion he'd ever cared about, that he had misjudged everything. Ailey turned away from him then and looked back at me. "And I'm not your mistress's daughter anymore," she said, her voice softening for the first time, something breaking gently open in it. "I'm Mom's daughter." I don't remember standing up. I only remember that, at some point, I was on my feet, and Emily was crossing the small distance between the stage and the front row, and I was holding my daughter the way I'd held her that very first night, 18 years earlier, when she was small enough to fit in one arm, and the whole rest of our story was still unwritten. The auditorium was silent for a few seconds longer. Then someone in the back began clapping, a teacher, I learned later, and the sound spread through the room like something catching fire, until the whole gymnasium was on its feet, applauding not for a valedictorian speech, but for a truth that had finally been spoken out loud by the one person whose voice mattered most. Daniel stood alone on that stage microphone, still in his hand, and for the first time in 18 years, no one in that room was looking at him at all. Daniel found me in the parking lot afterward, while Emily was still surrounded by friends and teachers offering congratulations she deserved, and he no longer had any claim to. He looked smaller out there in the afternoon light, the confidence that had carried him through 200 witnesses, now completely gone. "I made a mistake," he said. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, and when I spoke, my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. "No, Daniel," I said, "you made choices." It was the only thing I said to him that day that could be called a kind of revenge. And even that wasn't meant as cruelty. It was simply the truth delivered without the softening I'd spent 18 years offering him out of habit. A mistake is something that happens to you. A choice is something you make again and again until it becomes who you are. Daniel had chosen distance over presence, self-interest over partnership, and finally standing on that stage. Humiliation over the family he claimed to want to preserve. None of that was a mistake, it was a pattern. And patterns don't deserve the same forgiveness accidents do. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't list his failures. I simply told him that I had spent 18 years building a family, and that he was the one who had torn it down one quiet betrayal at a time, long before that microphone ever reached his hand. The weeks that followed were unremarkable in the way that matters most. The divorce proceeded through the courts the way divorces do, methodically, without theatrics. Diane handled the details, with the same steady competence she'd shown from our first meeting. The assets were divided according to the law, and the documentation I'd unknowingly spent 18 years assembling, not everything I might have fought for if I'd wanted to be vindictive, but everything that was rightfully mine, and nothing more. I never asked for anything beyond that. I didn't need to punish Daniel to feel like the truth had finally been told. Daniel lost far more than assets in the months that followed. He lost Emily's trust almost entirely, not through any dramatic rupture, but through her quiet, deliberate distance, fewer calls, shorter visits, a wall that hadn't existed before, and that he had built himself one absence at a time, long before she ever knew to notice it. Renee, it turned out, had no more genuine interest in rebuilding a relationship with either of them than she'd shown 18 years earlier. Whatever Daniel believed reconnecting with her might restore, it didn't materialize into anything lasting. Emily kept calling me Mom. She never wavered on that. Not once. Not even in the private moments when it would have been easiest to let the label slip into something more complicated. I think she understood better than most adults. I know that the word had never been about biology in the first place. I stayed in the army. There was something steadying about returning to the structure of that life, after everything else had shifted so completely. The discipline, the clarity, the sense of purpose that had carried me through every hard year since I was 22 years old. A few months later, Emily left for college, her dorm room packed into the back of my car. Both of us pretending neither of us was fighting back tears the entire drive. Before she walked into that dormitory building, she handed me a small, carefully wrapped gift. Inside was a framed photograph of the two of us taken at her graduation, both of us laughing at something now lost to memory. Underneath it, she'd had a single line engraved into the frame. "You didn't give birth to me. You gave me a life." I stood in that parking lot and cried harder than I had in 18 years. Harder even than the day I first held her. I think about that clinic parking lot often now, the one from all those years ago. The doctor's voice telling me the word unlikely in a tone meant to be gentle. I spent a long time believing that moment had defined the shape of my life, a door closing, a future narrowing. I understand now how wrong I was. That closed door simply made room for a different one to open. One I never could have predicted, holding a child who wasn't mine by blood, but became mine by every choice that mattered. Being a mother, I've learned, was never about giving birth. It was about staying, protecting, sacrificing without keeping score. Loving someone on the hard days as fiercely as the easy ones, choosing a child over and over, long after anyone would have blamed you for walking away. My husband thought he was exposing me that day on that stage. He never realized he was giving his daughter the chance to finally tell the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Blood may create a family, but love, sacrifice, and loyalty are what make one. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you today. Drop a comment below and tell me. We have new stories like this one every single day, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this one. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Let's keep going.